You don't belong in rooms like this. The words hit the boardroom like a dropped glass, sharp, unavoidable, and instantly silencing every conversation in the glass-walled suite on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Tower in Manhattan. Ava Johnson stood still near the long mahogany conference table, her hands steady on a stainless steel coffee tray that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Around her, men in tailored suits shifted in their seats, pretending not to watch, pretending not to hear, but no one looked away. At the head of the table, Richard Caldwell didn't even raise his voice when he repeated it. Calm, controlled, almost amused. I said you don't belong in rooms like this. Waitresses serve coffee. They don't think. A faint chuckle came from somewhere near the legal team, quickly swallowed by silence as Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the room like he owned the air itself. Ava didn't respond immediately. She had learned long ago that silence, when used correctly, was not submission. It was observation. She set the tray down with precision, each cup aligned perfectly, steam still rising from the freshly brewed coffee. Her uniform bore the logo of the hotel contracted for executive catering, but no one here cared about logos, only hierarchies. Richard Caldwell was a man who had built 3 companies, broken 2 competitors, and intimidated every board he had ever sat with. And in his mind, that made him untouchable. Do you understand what this meeting is? He asked, tapping a finger against a thick folder labeled Caldwell Global Merger, Final Draft. This is a $3 billion negotiation. We don't need distractions. Ava's gaze flicked briefly to the document before returning to his face. Something about the wording had caught her attention the moment she had entered the room. Something too precise, too carefully buried in legal language to be innocent. But she said nothing yet. Instead, she reached for the empty cup at the far end of the table, refilling it slowly, deliberately, as if the tension in the room did not exist. One of the junior analysts cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Another adjusted his tie. Richard watched her, like she was a background detail that had somehow refused to stay in the background. You're still here? He asked coldly. Ava finally looked up. Her voice was calm, almost soft. I'm here because I was assigned to this floor, sir. That answer drew another faint smirk from Richard. Assigned, he repeated. That's generous. People like you don't get assigned to decisions. You get assigned to service. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Ava didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes shifted again to the contract, just for a second longer this time. Clause 14. It wasn't obvious at first glance. It was written in the kind of legal structure meant to blend in, meant to be ignored by anyone not trained to see what was hidden inside it. But Ava had once spent 3 years studying corporate law before life redirected her path in ways she never planned to explain in a room like this. Richard noticed her gaze and followed it. Something interesting? He asked with mild irritation. Ava hesitated for the first time, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly what would happen if she spoke. Still, she stepped slightly closer to the table, her reflection faint in the polished wood surface. Clause 14, she said quietly. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough. Richard exhaled through his nose, amused. Go on, he said, as if indulging a child. Ava's voice remained steady. It transfers full liability to your company in the event of post-merger regulatory failure, even if the breach originates from the partner's side. The silence that followed wasn't immediate shock. It was calculation. The legal advisor at the table leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he reread the page. Richard's expression didn't change at first, but something behind his eyes tightened, subtle, like a door beginning to close. That's standard language, he said. Ava shook her head once, gently. Not the way it's written here. The air in the room grew heavier, not because of volume, but because of attention shifting. For the first time, Richard Caldwell didn't interrupt. He just looked at her. And Ava, standing in a room full of people who had already decided she didn't belong there, finally met his gaze without looking away. The room did not move at first, but something inside it had already shifted in a way no one could ignore. Richard Caldwell kept his eyes on Ava Johnson, not because he respected her words, but because he was trying to decide how they had even formed in the first place. Around him, the boardroom remained still, suspended between disbelief and quiet discomfort. The legal advisor slowly turned a page of the contract again, his brow tightening as he rechecked the language under Clause 14. Ava stood where she was, hands now resting lightly at her sides, her posture calm but alert, like someone who understood that the most dangerous moment in any room was not when people spoke loudly, but when they stopped speaking at all. Richard finally broke the silence with a controlled exhale. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that a waitress understands a multi-jurisdiction liability structure better than a team of corporate attorneys." His tone was not raised, but it carried weight, the kind of voice used to closing arguments, not conversations. Ava did not react to the word waitress. She had heard it too many times for it to still land as an insult, but she also knew exactly what it was meant to do in a room like this. "I am saying," she replied carefully, "that the language in Clause 14 is not standard protective language. It is a liability transfer mechanism disguised as mutual protection." A faint shift ran through the table. One of the junior analysts leaned toward the document again, this time reading silently instead of following along. Richard noticed it. His jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained composed. "And what exactly qualifies you to make that distinction?" he asked. Ava hesitated for half a second, not because she lacked an answer, but because she knew that any answer she gave would change the way she was seen in this room forever. "I studied corporate and contract law for 3 years," she said finally, "before I had to leave school." That sentence landed differently. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with enough weight to alter the silence. No one interrupted this time. Richard studied her face more closely now, as if recalibrating a calculation that had stopped making sense. "You left school," he repeated, "and now you serve coffee in merger meetings." Ava nodded once. Life does not always follow the original plan. There was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. The legal advisor cleared his throat, uncomfortable, and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Caldwell," he said cautiously, "she may be referring to the clause where liability is assigned to the acquiring entity under conditions of post-closing compliance failure. That section was revised recently." Richard did not look at him. His attention stayed on Ava. "Revised by who?" he asked. The advisor hesitated. "Internal Compliance Review, I believe." Ava's eyes moved back to the document. "Not properly reviewed," she corrected softly. That word properly changed the temperature in the room more than anything else had so far. Richard finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. For the first time, his voice lost a fraction of its casual dismissal. "Explain," he said. Ava stepped closer to the table again, this time not as a service worker placing coffee, but as someone addressing the document itself. "Clause 14 creates asymmetric liability exposure," she said. "It states that any regulatory discrepancy identified after merger execution, regardless of originating entity, becomes the responsibility of Caldwell Global. That includes documentation submitted by the partner organization, even if Caldwell Global had no operational control over it." The legal advisor stopped flipping pages. One of the executives frowned. Another shifted in his seat. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, slower now. "That is intentional risk allocation," he said. Ava shook her head slightly. "It would be, if the language did not conflict with Section 9, which defines mutual indemnification boundaries. These two sections override each other in a way that creates legal ambiguity." A pause followed. This time, it was not silence out of intimidation. It was silence out of recognition. Richard looked at the contract again, then back at her. Something in his expression had begun to change, though he had not admitted it yet. "You are saying this document contradicts itself," he said. Ava answered without hesitation. "Yes." The word was simple, but it carried consequences. The legal advisor leaned back slowly in his chair, suddenly less certain of his earlier confidence. "If that is accurate," he said quietly, "then enforcement could be problematic." Richard finally broke eye contact with Ava and looked at the document fully for the first time since she had spoken. The room no longer belonged to authority. It belonged to uncertainty. Ava remained still, waiting, not pushing, not pleading, just observing the way truth began to settle differently when it could no longer be ignored. The tension in the boardroom did not dissolve after Ava Johnson finished speaking. It deepened in a way that made even the air feel heavier. Richard Caldwell remained seated at the head of the table, his eyes now fixed on the contract instead of the people around it, as if the document itself had become unfamiliar. The confidence that usually defined his posture was still there, but it was no longer effortless. It was controlled, restrained, like a system recalculating under unexpected input. Ava stood quietly near the side of the table, no longer the focus of attention by force, but by consequence. The legal advisor slowly turned another page, this time reading each line with deliberate care. A faint crease formed between his eyebrows as he followed the structure of Clause 14 again, cross-checking it against Section 9. Another executive leaned forward slightly, breaking his own silence for the first time. If what she is saying is correct, he said cautiously, this does not just shift liability. It changes jurisdictional exposure across multiple subsidiaries. The words landed carefully, but they still shifted the room further into uncertainty. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava again, this time not with dismissal, but with a measured, analytical focus, the kind used when evaluating risk rather than personality. You are making a serious claim, he said finally. Ava nodded once. I am pointing out a contradiction in legal structure that has serious consequences if executed as written. Her tone remained calm, without triumph or hesitation, only clarity. The legal advisor exhaled slowly and adjusted the document in his hands. There is a conflict here, he admitted quietly, almost reluctantly. Section 9 limits liability transfer to direct operational negligence, but Clause 14 extends it to all post-closing regulatory findings regardless of source. Those two conditions cannot coexist without creating enforceability issues. A subtle shift passed through the room. It was no longer about Ava's presence or position. It was about the realization that the foundation of the deal they were preparing to finalize might not be stable. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers now resting still instead of tapping. Who drafted Clause 14? He asked, his voice lower than before. The legal advisor hesitated. It came from external counsel recommended by the partner's side, he replied. That sentence introduced a new layer of silence, sharper than before. Ava watched carefully, not intervening, but observing how information moved through authority when it no longer supported certainty. Richard stood up slowly from his seat. The movement was controlled, deliberate, but it changed the energy of the room instantly. He walked toward the table, stopping just behind the contract, looking down at it as if seeing it for the first time in its final form rather than its assumed intent. External counsel, he repeated. There was no accusation in his voice yet, only focus. One of the senior executives shifted uncomfortably. We relied on their compliance review, he said quickly. They provided the final draft with assurances that all liability structures were aligned with standard merger protocols. Ava's eyes remained on the document. Standard protocols do not override internal consistency checks, she said softly. The legal advisor glanced at her again, this time with something closer to respect than skepticism. She is correct, he admitted. This should have been flagged before final negotiation. Richard turned slightly toward him. Should have been. He repeated. The weight of those words settled across the table. Ava stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating distance from the center of authority, now shifting away from certainty and toward investigation. She understood something important in that moment. The contract was no longer just a document. It was a structure of trust that had just begun to fracture under its own complexity. Richard returned to his seat, but he did not sit fully. Instead, he placed one hand on the edge of the table, studying the page again. If this clause is enforced, he said slowly, it would expose Caldwell Global to liability for actions outside its operational control. The legal advisor nodded. Yes. A pause followed. This time no one tried to fill it. Ava spoke again, carefully. It also creates a dependency loophole, she said. Any minor discrepancy in the partner's filings after merger execution could trigger full liability transfer without direct causation. That statement changed the room again. One of the executives quietly closed his folder. Another leaned back in his chair, processing the implications in silence. Richard finally looked at Ava directly again. This time his expression was no longer dismissive or controlled. It was calculating, not against her, but with her input now integrated into the reality he was reconstructing. How did you see this so quickly, he asked. Ava did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. Because I have seen similar structures before, and because I was trained to read what is not immediately visible in the language. That sentence did not sound like arrogance. It sounded like experience. Richard studied her for a long moment, and for the first time, the assumption that she did not belong in this room had fully collapsed, replaced by something more complicated, something that would change the direction of everything that followed. The silence that followed Ava Johnson's explanation did not feel like the end of an argument. It felt like the beginning of something far more unstable. Richard Caldwell remained standing near the head of the table, his attention no longer divided between authority and dismissal, but fully anchored on the contract spread in front of him. The glass walls of the 42nd floor reflected the city skyline behind him, but none of it seemed relevant now. What mattered was the structure of words on paper that suddenly no longer behaved like certainty. Ava stood a few steps away from the table, no longer ignored, but also not yet accepted into the center of decision-making. The space around her had changed in a way that was subtle but undeniable. People who had previously looked through her were now looking at her. The legal advisor carefully placed the document down and exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for too long. "We need to run a full structural review," he said quietly. "If Clause 14 interacts with Section 9 the way she described, then the enforceability risk is not theoretical. It is immediate." One of the senior executives leaned forward, his tone more controlled than before. "If this is accurate, then we are looking at exposure across all post-merger compliance cycles for at least the first 18 months. That number changed the atmosphere again. 18 months was not abstract. It was operational planning, financial forecasting, and regulatory exposure all at once. Richard finally turned away from the document and looked directly at Ava again. This time his expression was not shaped by confidence or dismissal, but by evaluation. "You said you studied corporate law," he said. Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Where?" he asked. The question was not casual anymore. It was precise. Ava hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she lacked the answer, but because she understood what it would imply in this room. "Columbia University," she said. "I completed 3 years before I had to leave." A faint shift passed through the executives at the table. Columbia was not a detail that could be dismissed easily. Richard's gaze narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recalibration. "Why did you leave before completion?" he asked. Ava kept her voice steady. "Family medical circumstances required immediate financial support. I transitioned into service work because it was the fastest stable option available." There was no emotional framing in her answer, only fact. The legal advisor glanced at her again, this time with visible reconsideration of every assumption he had made earlier. Richard stepped back toward his chair, but did not sit. Instead, he placed both hands on the table and looked down at the contract again, as if trying to determine whether it had changed or whether his perception of it had. "Run me through Clause 14 again," he said finally. Ava did not move closer this time. She stayed where she was and repeated her analysis with the same clarity. Clause 14 assigns post-closing regulatory liability to Caldwell Global for any compliance discrepancies discovered after merger execution, regardless of originating party. However, Section 9 restricts liability to direct operational negligence within controlled subsidiaries. Because both clauses define overlapping jurisdiction without hierarchy language, enforcement interpretation defaults to maximum exposure under regulatory arbitration standards. The legal advisor nodded slowly as she spoke, confirming each point silently. Richard listened without interruption, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no attempt to challenge the source of the information. Only the information itself mattered now. "So you are saying," Richard said slowly, "that if this agreement is executed as written, we inherit responsibility for actions we do not control?" Ava answered immediately. "Yes, sir. That is the structural outcome based on current wording." A long pause followed, the kind of pause that did not belong to conversation anymore, but to decision-making. One of the executives finally spoke again, more carefully than before. "We need to determine whether this was intentional design or drafting failure." Richard did not answer him. His focus remained on Ava. "If this was intentional," he said slowly, "then someone constructed a liability trap inside a $3 billion transaction." The weight of that statement changed the room again. Ava did not respond, because she understood that speculation was no longer her role in this moment. She had already done what she needed to do, which was expose structure, not intent. The legal advisor closed the folder slightly, and looked at Richard. "We should pause all finalization steps until external verification is complete," he said. Richard finally sat down, but the movement was slower now, more deliberate, as if each action required recalibration. He folded his hands on the table and looked at the contract again, then at the team, then back at Ava. The dismissal that had defined the beginning of this meeting no longer existed in the same form. It had been replaced by something far more complicated, a forced recognition that the person who had been overlooked was now central to understanding the risk they were facing. Ava remained still, waiting for nothing, offering nothing beyond what she had already given. But in the quiet tension of the 42nd floor boardroom, it had become clear that the conversation had already moved beyond permission and into consequence. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had changed its atmosphere again, but this time the shift was not subtle or gradual. It was the kind of shift that happens when authority stops pretending to be absolute and starts reacting instead of leading. Richard Caldwell sat at the head of the table, no longer the unchallenged center of the room, but the person responsible for deciding what came next. The contract lay open in front of him, untouched for several seconds now, as if even physical contact with it required caution. Around him, the executives had moved from passive observation to structured concern, quietly exchanging notes and recalculating exposure scenarios on their tablets. The legal advisor had already opened a secondary file, cross-referencing regulatory clauses and internal compliance standards, his expression increasingly focused. Ava Johnson stood slightly away from the table, still not part of the seated hierarchy, but no longer outside of the conversation either. The distance between her and the others was no longer about status. It was about origin. She had entered this moment as a service worker. She remained in it as the only person who had clearly understood the structure they were all now questioning. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before. "Pause all final approval processes," he said. The executive to his right nodded immediately, already typing the instruction into the system. The legal advisor did not argue. He simply confirmed with a quiet, "understood," and continued reviewing the contract. Ava did not move. She did not need to. The information she had already provided was now circulating through the room, like a delayed reaction finally reaching full awareness. One of the executives leaned forward slightly. "If we delay execution, we may lose the acquisition window," he said carefully. Richard did not look at him when he answered. "If we proceed without understanding the liability structure, we lose the company." That sentence ended the debate more effectively than any formal decision could have. The room settled into a new form of silence, one defined not by intimidation, but by recalculation. Ava's presence in that silence had changed meaning. She was no longer being evaluated as an anomaly. She was being processed as a variable that had already altered the outcome. The legal advisor turned another page and spoke without looking up. "We will need to revalidate every clause that interacts with jurisdictional liability transfer," he said. "This may require external arbitration review and full redrafting of the agreement." Richard nodded once. "Do it." Then, after a brief pause, he looked at Ava again. "Stay," he said. The word was simple, but it carried a different weight than anything he had said earlier. It was no longer dismissal or curiosity. It was retention. Ava did not respond immediately. She understood that the request was not informal. It was structural. "I am not part of your legal team," she said carefully. Richard did not deny it. "You are not," he agreed. "But you identified a failure that my legal team missed." That acknowledgement shifted the room again. It was not praise. It was recognition of function. Ava remained composed. "Then your legal team should correct it," she said. The legal advisor gave a brief nod, accepting the statement without resistance. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her now with sustained attention rather than fragmented judgment. The earlier assumptions about her role had fully collapsed, replaced by something more complicated, something that required reevaluation rather than dismissal. "How long did it take you to see it?" he asked. Ava considered the question. "Less than a minute after reading the clause in context," she said. A faint pause followed. One of the executives looked down at the contract again, as if trying to see what she had seen through repetition alone. Richard's expression remained controlled, but something in his posture had changed. It was no longer dominance. It was assessment. "You understand what this means?" he said. Ava met his gaze. It means your agreement contains a structural vulnerability that could transfer multi-jurisdictional liability without operational control alignment. The precision of her answer removed any remaining doubt in the room. The legal advisor closed the folder fully this time, signaling that review had reached a critical threshold. She is correct, he said quietly. This cannot proceed in its current form. Richard did not react outwardly, but the silence that followed him now was different from the silence he had commanded earlier. It was the silence of recalibration. Ava stepped back slightly, not retreating, but re-establishing distance from a room that had already begun redefining her place within it. She had not raised her voice. She had not asserted authority. She had simply identified structure where others had assumed stability. And in doing so, she had shifted the direction of a $3 billion decision without ever asking for permission to be heard. The silence inside the 42nd floor boardroom was no longer passive. It had become something active, something almost physical, as if the realization spreading through the room had weight. Richard Caldwell remained seated, but his posture had shifted slightly, no longer relaxed in authority, but focused in evaluation. The contract lay open in front of him, untouched for several minutes, while the implications of its structure continued to unfold in real time through the discussion. Ava Johnson stood near the edge of the table, not participating in the conversation that was now happening between executives and legal counsel, but still shaping its direction by presence alone. The legal advisor had moved from explanation to correction, quietly outlining the steps required to contain the exposure created by Clause 14. We will need an immediate internal audit of all contractual dependencies tied to post-closing liability allocation, he said, his voice steady but more serious than before. This is no longer a theoretical drafting issue. It is a structural compliance risk. One of the senior executives nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the statement. Another had already opened a secure communication channel on his tablet, preparing to notify external partners of a temporary suspension. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the contract again, but this time without the assumption that it represented control. It now represented uncertainty. Ava remained still, her attention not on the reaction in the room, but on the way decisions were forming in response to information she had not been asked to provide, but had been necessary to expose. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice quieter than before. If we had executed this today, he said, we would have absorbed full liability exposure without operational safeguards. No one disagreed. The legal advisor confirmed it with a short nod. That is the correct interpretation under current wording. The acknowledgement settled across the table like a structural correction in real time. Ava's role in the room had shifted again without any formal change in title or status. She was no longer being questioned. She was being referenced. One of the executives turned slightly toward her. How did this pass internal review unnoticed? He asked, not defensively, but genuinely unsettled. The legal advisor answered before Ava could. Because the contradiction only appears when clauses are cross-referenced under jurisdictional overlap conditions, he said. Most standard review processes isolate sections rather than simulate interaction between them. Richard leaned back slightly, processing that explanation without interrupting. The flaw was not visible in isolation. It only emerged when viewed as a system. His gaze returned to Ava. You saw the system, he said. Ava nodded once. I read it as a whole structure, not as separate sections. That distinction lingered in the room longer than her words. Richard stood up again, this time moving slowly toward the window. The city below stretched outward in structured grids of glass and steel, indifferent to the decisions being made above it. We are going to suspend execution, he said finally. The executive closest to him immediately began documenting the directive. We will initiate full clause reconstruction under legal supervision and independent review. No one challenged the decision. It was no longer a debate. It was containment. Ava did not move as the room adjusted around her new role in the situation. She had not requested involvement. She had only identified failure. Yet the consequences of that identification now extended across an agreement worth billions. Richard turned back toward the table. You should not have been the one to find this, he said, not as criticism, but as observation. Ava met his gaze evenly. I was the one who noticed it, she replied. There was no pride in her tone, only accuracy. The The legal advisor closed the folder completely now, signaling that the meeting had shifted fully into response mode rather than negotiation. We will need to reconstruct the liability architecture from the ground up, he said. Richard nodded once. Begin immediately. Then he paused, looking at Ava for a longer moment than before. The earlier assumption that she did not belong in this environment had not only been broken. It had been replaced by something far more difficult to ignore. She had not interrupted authority. She had corrected structure. And in doing so, she had altered the trajectory of a decision that was supposed to be finalized that day. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of recalculation, where every assumption had to be rebuilt from the beginning. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had entered a different state of stillness, one that no longer belonged to surprise or confusion, but to structural consequence. Richard Caldwell stood near the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, his reflection layered over the city lights like a double exposure of authority and recalculation. Behind him, the executives had shifted from discussion to execution mode, each one absorbed in recalibrating risk frameworks, compliance protocols, and contract suspension procedures. The legal advisor was now speaking in controlled, precise updates, coordinating with internal compliance teams to isolate every clause connected to the disputed liability structure. Ava Johnson remained near the table, no longer treated as an external presence, but not yet integrated into the corporate hierarchy either. She occupied a space that did not have a defined label in the system she had just helped destabilize. Richard finally turned away from the window and walked back toward the table. His movements were measured, no longer driven by authority, but by the need to understand how that authority had just been challenged without confrontation. We will reconstruct the entire liability framework before any external communication is released, he said. The legal advisor nodded immediately. We have already initiated clause mapping across all subsidiary agreements linked to the merger structure. One of the executives added quietly, regulatory notification may be required within 24 hours depending on jurisdictional thresholds. Richard acknowledged the statement without responding directly. His attention returned to Ava. The room followed that shift instinctively. She was no longer an observer. She was now part of the reason everything had stopped moving forward. You are not part of this organization, Richard said slowly, not as a challenge, but as a factual reminder. Ava nodded. That is correct. The simplicity of her response made the statement heavier, not lighter. Richard studied her for a long moment before continuing. And yet you identified a structural failure that 3 separate legal teams did not detect. Ava did not react to the implication. She simply replied. The failure was visible when clauses were analyzed as a single system rather than isolated components. The legal advisor looked up briefly, then returned to his screen, confirming alignment between her assessment and internal findings. Richard moved back toward the table and placed one hand on its surface, grounding himself in the physical reality of the situation. Explain something to me, he said. Ava remained still. Why would anyone design a clause structure that creates liability exposure without operational causation alignment? Ava considered the question carefully. There are only 2 possibilities, she said. Either it was a drafting oversight under rushed external legal coordination, or it was intentional risk displacement designed to shift post-execution accountability under ambiguous jurisdictional interpretation. The room absorbed that distinction in silence. It was no longer about error alone. It was about intent. One of the senior executives finally spoke, his voice lower than before. If it is intentional, then someone inside the negotiation chain benefits from that exposure shifting. The legal advisor nodded slowly. That would imply internal misalignment between drafting counsel and strategic oversight. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at the contract again, but now with a different perspective. It was no longer a deal to be executed. It was a system to be audited. We will identify origin of Clause 14, he said finally. His voice carried no emotion, only direction. The legal advisor confirmed the instruction. We will trace version history and submission routing from external counsel through all internal review checkpoints. Ava remained silent during this exchange. She had already completed her function in the room. Everything after that belonged to the organization's response structure. Richard turned toward her once more. "You should have been in this room earlier," he said. It was not accusation. It was recognition of absence. Ava answered without hesitation. "I was in the room because I was delivering service," she said. "Not because I was invited to participate in decision-making." That sentence settled heavily across the table. No one contradicted it. Richard looked at her for a moment longer, then shifted his attention back to the team. "Ensure she is documented as a contributing source in the internal review report," he said. The legal advisor paused briefly before nodding. "Understood." Ava did not react to the instruction. She understood what it meant: recognition without integration, acknowledgement without structure. Richard finally stepped back from the table. The immediate crisis was no longer about execution. It was about reconstruction. And in the quiet aftermath of that realization, the presence of the woman who had first been dismissed as invisible had become the single reference point for everything they now had to rebuild. The 42nd floor of Caldwell Tower no longer felt like a space designed for negotiation. It felt like a space in transition, where every decision that had once seemed final was now being rewritten in real time. The city outside continued its rhythm of movement and noise, but inside the glass walls, everything had slowed into deliberate reconstruction. Richard Caldwell stood near the center of the boardroom, no longer in the position of absolute authority, but in the position of responsibility for what had just been exposed. The legal advisor had moved into full response mode, coordinating a structured audit of every contractual layer connected to the merger, while executives worked through risk models that now had to account for structural uncertainty instead of assumed compliance. Ava Johnson remained near the edge of the table, still not seated, still not formally integrated into any defined role within the organization, yet undeniably central to every decision being made. Richard finally broke the working silence. His voice was steady, but it no longer carried the same unquestioned certainty it had held earlier. "We will suspend all external communication regarding the merger until full structural validation is complete," he said. The legal advisor confirmed immediately. "We have already initiated documentation control protocols and isolated all affected contract versions." One of the executives added, "Regulatory liaison teams will need updated briefing materials within the next operational cycle." Richard nodded once, acknowledging the procedural steps without interruption. Then his attention shifted again to Ava. The room followed that shift instinctively. "This situation would not have been detected before execution without your input," Richard said. It was not a compliment. It was an acknowledgement of systemic dependency. Ava responded calmly. It was detectable. It was only not being evaluated at the correct level of structural interaction. Richard studied her for a moment, then turned slightly toward the legal advisor. "Document her analysis as a critical discovery input in the internal review record." The legal advisor paused briefly, then nodded. "It will be formally recorded." Ava did not react outwardly to the instruction. She understood what it meant. Recognition within a system did not automatically translate into inclusion within it. Richard walked slowly back toward the table and placed one hand on its surface, as if grounding himself in the reality of decisions that could no longer be reversed. "You identified something that 3 independent legal reviews failed to see," he said. "That changes the way this organization evaluates internal review dependency moving forward." Ava replied without hesitation. "It changes the way documents are interpreted under assumed consistency." The distinction was precise, and it did not go unnoticed. One of the senior executives leaned back slightly, processing the implications not only for the deal, but for the internal structure of their entire review system. The legal advisor closed his folder and spoke in a lower tone. "We will need to re-establish baseline validation standards for all future high-value agreements." Richard nodded once. "Agreed." A brief silence followed, not empty, but reflective. Then Richard looked at Ava again, this time without any remaining trace of dismissal or surprise. "What you exposed today prevented a multi-billion-dollar exposure event," he said. Ava remained composed. "I did not prevent it," she said. "I identified it before execution." Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, then slowly shifted his posture. The authority in the room had not disappeared, but it had changed direction. It was no longer centered on control. It was now centered on understanding. "We are going to need structural advisors going forward who can operate at this level of analysis," Richard said. The legal advisor nodded immediately. We can begin recruitment and vetting protocols for specialized contract systems analysts. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava for a longer moment than before. The room sensed the shift before it was spoken. You are already inside this system whether you were invited or not, he said finally. Ava did not answer immediately. She understood the implication, but she also understood the boundary that still existed. I am not part of your organization, she said carefully. Richard nodded slightly. Not officially, he agreed. Then he added, but functionally, you are already embedded in the outcome of this process. That statement changed the atmosphere again, not through authority, but through inevitability. Ava looked toward the contract one final time, now marked with annotations, flags, and corrections that had not existed an hour earlier. She had entered the room as someone delivering service. She had remained in it as someone who identified structural failure. Now she stood in a space where her presence had become part of the system's correction mechanism, whether formal recognition followed or not. Richard stepped back from the table, signaling a transition from immediate crisis response to strategic restructuring. This meeting is concluded in its original form, he said. We move into reconstruction phase effective immediately. Executives began gathering their materials, voices lower, movements more deliberate. The urgency had not disappeared, but it had transformed into controlled execution. Ava remained where she was for a moment longer, observing the room that had changed because of what she had revealed, not because of any request she had made. As she finally turned to leave, there was no celebration, no confrontation, and no final statement. Only the quiet acknowledgement that what had once been invisible could no longer be ignored. And behind her, the structure she had exposed continued to be rebuilt piece by piece in silence. The morning after the boardroom reconstruction began, Caldwell Tower felt different in a way that could not be explained by lighting or schedule alone. The 42nd floor, once defined by certainty and uninterrupted authority, now carried the quiet tension of systems being rewritten in real time. Legal teams moved through structured review cycles, executives coordinated recalibration of risk frameworks, and communication channels remained open but controlled, as if every message now required validation before being allowed to exist. Richard Caldwell stood near the glass wall again, looking out over Manhattan, but his focus was no longer external. It was internal, directed at the instability that had been exposed within one of his most critical transactions. Ava Johnson had already left the boardroom the previous day without ceremony or announcement. There had been no formal recognition beyond documentation of her analysis, no structural integration into the organization, and no attempt to redefine her role beyond what protocol allowed. Yet her findings continued to propagate through every layer of review currently underway. Inside the legal department, Clause 14 had already become a reference point in every compliance discussion. Not because it was complex, but because it had revealed a failure in the assumption that complexity alone guaranteed safety. Richard entered the executive review room later that morning. The atmosphere inside was controlled, focused, and noticeably more cautious than before. The legal advisor stood at the head of the table with updated structural maps of the contract network displayed across multiple screens. We have completed initial decomposition of all liability pathways, he said. Every clause connected to post-merger exposure has been reclassified under independent validation review. Richard nodded once and took a seat. Status of Clause 14 origin tracing, he asked. The legal advisor responded immediately. We have identified submission routing through external counsel, with internal approval marked at preliminary review stage. However, no cross-validation audit was conducted prior to integration into final draft. One of the executives leaned forward. Meaning it passed through standard channels without structural simulation testing, he clarified. Correct, the legal advisor confirmed. Richard exhaled slowly, then looked at the screen displaying the clause network. So the failure was not in the clause alone, he said. It was in the assumption that standard review was sufficient. No one contradicted him. Ava Johnson was not in the room, but her analysis was still present in every decision being discussed. The absence of her physical presence made her impact more visible, not less. The system was now reacting to what she had revealed, not to her. Later that afternoon, Richard requested access to the full annotated review file that had been compiled based on her analysis. He reviewed it alone, without the legal team present. The document did not contain interpretation beyond structural mapping. It contained identification of conflict points, jurisdictional overlaps, and logical inconsistencies between liability allocation frameworks. What stood out was not complexity, but clarity. The issues were not hidden in sophistication. They were hidden in assumption. Richard closed the file and sat in silence for several minutes. The realization that a single external observer had identified what internal systems had overlooked did not register as failure alone. It registered as structural blindness. At the same time, across the city, Ava Johnson was not involved in any corporate environment. She had returned to her routine life outside of executive spaces, carrying no indication that the previous day had altered decisions worth billions. There were no media mentions, no formal acknowledgments, and no public references to her involvement. Yet within Caldwell Global, her analysis had already been integrated into a full restructuring protocol for high-value contract evaluation. That evening, Richard reviewed the final internal directive prepared by the legal department. It outlined new mandatory requirements for all future agreements exceeding specified financial thresholds. Clause interaction, simulation, cross-jurisdictional dependency analysis, and external structural validation would now be required